do, as is my wont, I would walk onto the set sometimes, and I would usually sing, "Oh, the good life," kind of in my best Tony Bennett kind of derivative. And he called me one afternoon and said, "Hey, do you still sing, Kels?"
For millions of viewers, John Mahoney was simply Martin Crane, the gruff father who somehow survived living with two highly educated, endlessly argumentative sons. But for Kelsey Grammer, the relationship was far more complicated. What audiences saw as brilliant sitcom chemistry became something deeply personal behind the scenes. Grammer had spent much of his childhood without a dependable father figure, and by the time he met Mahoney, that absence had already shaped much of his life. Then, almost by accident, an actor walked onto a television set and gave him something he had stopped expecting to ever experience. Mahoney wasn't just convincing as Martin Crane. He became a steady presence Grammer could trust, someone whose kindness existed beyond the script. The strange part is that neither man could have known where that relationship would eventually lead. Before Grammer became one of television's biggest stars, however, his life had already been marked by losses that most people would struggle to imagine. And the first one happened when he was still a teenager. Kelsey Grammer was born in 1955 in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but his childhood quickly became complicated. His parents separated when he was very young, leaving Grammer and his sister Karen to grow up largely away from their father. Their mother and grandfather provided stability, while his biological father remained a distant figure, living his own life in St. Thomas. That distance mattered. Grammer didn't grow up with the ordinary experiences many people associate with having a father around. The everyday conversations, advice, disagreements, or quiet moments that gradually build a relationship. His grandfather became an important presence instead, but there was still a space in Grammer's life that never completely disappeared. Then, when he was only 13, that complicated relationship was cut short forever. His father was killed after an attack on the family property in 1968. Suddenly, the boy who barely had the chance to know his father was left with no possibility of ever changing that relationship. And years later, another devastating loss would hit even closer to home. Losing a parent at 13 would be enough to change almost anyone's life. For Grammer, it became the beginning of a much darker pattern. His father's death left him trying to understand grief before he was old enough to fully understand the relationship he had lost. There were no decades of memories to revisit, no long history of conversations to draw comfort from. Instead, there was an unfinished relationship and a permanent absence. Grammer continued growing up, but the loss followed him. Then, just a few years later, tragedy struck again. His younger sister Karen was killed in Colorado in 1975 at just 18 years old. Grammer was only 20. The news reportedly arrived in the most devastating way possible, with detectives coming to his home before he traveled to Colorado to help identify her. It was another loss he could never simply put behind him. Later in life, Grammer would speak and write more openly about the effect Karen's death had on him, describing a period when happiness itself became difficult to reach. But the worst part was that his family tragedy wasn't finished yet. By his early 20s, Grammer had already experienced more grief than most people encounter in an entire lifetime. His father's death had taken away a relationship he never had the chance to develop. His sister's death shattered another important connection. Then, in 1980, tragedy struck again when his half-brothers Billy and Stephen died in a diving accident in the Virgin Islands. Grammer was around 25 at the time. The losses were coming faster than anyone could reasonably process them. Father, sister, brothers. Each event added another layer to an emotional burden he was still trying to carry. From the outside, none of this was necessarily visible. Grammer was young, ambitious, and determined to become an actor. But internally, he was dealing with grief that had nowhere healthy to go. He would later acknowledge that the pain contributed to some destructive choices during the years that followed. Instead of finding a way to confront everything at once, he often tried to escape it. And eventually, that escape began creating problems of its own. The young actor who would eventually become Frasier Crane wasn't living the polished Hollywood life audiences might imagine. During the years after these devastating losses, Grammer struggled with alcohol and cocaine and became involved in several legal problems, including drunk driving arrests and a drug possession case. His career was beginning to rise, but his personal life was moving in the opposite direction. Eventually, he sought professional treatment, recognizing that simply trying to outrun the past wasn't working. What makes this period important isn't just the trouble itself. It's what Grammer later revealed about the emotional battle underneath it. Part of him understood that he needed to stop. Another part seemed almost willing to let the pain consume him. Acting became one of the few places where those emotions could be redirected into something productive. Instead of pretending the past never happened, he could turn complicated feelings into characters, voices, and performances. But nobody watching television at the time could have predicted what would happen next. The struggling young actor was about to stumble into a role that would completely change his life, and eventually lead him straight to the man he would call his TV father. Kelsey Grammer was becoming successful, but success didn't automatically erase what had happened before it. Behind the growing recognition was a man still trying to understand years of grief, addiction, and personal chaos. He eventually entered treatment and began confronting problems that had followed him for years. Grammer later described an internal battle between the part of him that knew he needed to stop and another part that almost wanted to keep hurting himself emotionally. That struggle makes his eventual career even more remarkable. He wasn't simply an actor who suddenly became famous. He was someone trying to build a future while carrying an enormous amount of unresolved pain. And perhaps that is one reason acting became so important to him. On stage and in front of cameras, emotions had somewhere to go. Pain could become a character. Fear could become a performance. Grief could become something audiences connected with. If you're enjoying this deeper look into Grammer's story, like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories behind the stars we think we already know, because his biggest break was still ahead. Before television fame arrived, Grammer was already proving himself in theater. He worked on Broadway and took on demanding stage roles, learning how to command an audience without depending on television cameras or celebrity recognition. Theater gave him something he desperately needed: structure. Every performance had a beginning, a middle, and an ending. For someone whose personal life had been filled with unpredictable tragedy, that structure mattered. He could walk onto a stage carrying one emotion and leave with another. Then came an opportunity that seemed almost too small to matter. Through professional connections in the theater world, Grammer met people who recognized his potential as a comedic performer. One conversation eventually led to an audition for a character being introduced on Cheers. It wasn't supposed to become the defining role of his career. At first, Frasier Crane was simply a new psychiatrist joining an established sitcom. Grammer walked into the audition without knowing that this strange opportunity would eventually make him a household name. But there was something about his performance that immediately caught the producer's attention. When Kelsey Grammer auditioned for Cheers, he wasn't the obvious choice for television superstardom. The show was already established, and Frasier Crane was initially designed as a supporting character. Grammer reportedly arrived with a very specific idea of how the psychiatrist should look and sound, creating a polished, sophisticated personality that could stand apart from the rest of the bar's eccentric crowd. The producers liked what they saw. His first appearance came in 1984, and almost immediately, Frasier had a distinctive presence. He was arrogant enough to be funny, intelligent enough to hold his own, and vulnerable enough for audiences to eventually care about him. What started as a temporary role became something much bigger. Grammer remained with Cheers through its final season, watching the show evolve around him, and becoming one of its most recognizable performers. But there was another surprise hiding inside those years. While audiences were getting to know Frasier, Grammer was quietly creating another character that would become legendary. But this one wouldn't even appear on a live-action set. As Cheers continued, Frasier Crane became far more important than anyone initially expected. Grammer had transformed what could have been a forgettable supporting character into someone with enough personality to carry his own stories. But there was a problem. By the time the series approached its end, Grammer wasn't convinced he wanted to spend the rest of his career playing Frasier. He had other ambitions and reportedly wanted to move toward a completely different television project. The studio, however, saw something Grammer couldn't ignore. Frasier had become an established audience favorite. Instead of abandoning the character, they pushed for a spin-off. Grammer eventually agreed, but he wanted the new series to feel different from Cheers. The setting changed, the supporting cast changed, and Frasier's life moved to Seattle. Yet one decision would become more important than almost anything else. Frasier needed a father. That single casting choice would eventually transform the fictional character's life, and unexpectedly change Grammer's own life too. During the same period that Frasier was becoming a television icon, Grammer was building an entirely different legacy. On The Simpsons, he became the voice of Sideshow Bob, the sophisticated criminal mastermind whose theatrical personality made him one of the show's most memorable recurring characters. The idea worked because Grammer could bring something unusual to the role: genuine theatricality. His voice sounded refined, dramatic, and almost ridiculously serious, which made Bob's schemes even funnier. The character also allowed Grammer to use skills he had developed long before Hollywood fame, including his love of classic theater and musical performance. It was another reminder that his career wasn't built from one lucky break. He had spent years collecting different abilities, and suddenly television had found ways to use all of them. Yet despite the success, his biggest personal breakthrough hadn't happened yet. The new Frasier series needed someone to play Martin Crane, and Grammer already had one actor in mind. He didn't want the usual audition process. He wanted John Mahoney. When Cheers finally ended in 1993, Kelsey Grammer wasn't desperate to keep playing Frasier Crane. In fact, he had grown tired of the character and wanted to try something completely different. He reportedly pitched a new sitcom built around a man recovering from a motorcycle accident, hoping to leave Frasier behind. But the studio had another idea. They believed Frasier had too much potential to simply disappear. Their answer was a spin-off. At first, Grammer wasn't convinced. A spin-off could easily feel like a weaker copy of the original show, and Cheers had already set a very high standard. But eventually, the idea began taking shape. Frasier would leave Boston and return to Seattle, where he would begin a new chapter as a radio psychiatrist. The new series needed a different family dynamic, and that meant giving Frasier something audiences had barely seen before: his father. Finding the right actor for that role would become one of the most important decisions in the show's history. John Mahoney wasn't a stranger to Kelsey Grammer. The two actors had crossed paths during Cheers, and Grammer had immediately enjoyed working with him. Mahoney was an accomplished stage actor with a calm, grounded presence that could balance Grammer's more elaborate personality. So when the Frasier pilot was being developed, Grammer didn't simply wait for casting directors to find a suitable actor. He made a personal choice. He contacted Mahoney and asked him to read the script. More importantly, Grammer told him directly that he wanted him to play his father. Mahoney agreed. It sounds like an ordinary Hollywood casting story, but nobody knew how significant that decision would become. On paper, Martin Crane was simply a retired police officer who had been injured in the line of duty and needed to move in with his son. But Mahoney brought a warmth and authenticity to the character that made Martin feel like a real person. And for Grammer, the connection went far beyond acting. There was an interesting detail about the casting that could have easily become a problem. John Mahoney was only about 15 years older than Kelsey Grammer in real life. That isn't a huge age gap between two adults, and on paper, it could have made the father-son relationship difficult to sell. Yet the moment they shared the screen, the concern practically disappeared. Mahoney carried himself with the quiet authority the role demanded, while Grammer gave Frasier the slightly complicated energy of a son who desperately wanted his father's approval, but didn't always know how to ask for it. Their differences created the comedy. Martin was practical, blunt, and comfortable with ordinary life. Frasier was sophisticated, particular, and often far too impressed with his own intelligence. They argued about furniture, food, relationships, and almost everything else. But underneath those disagreements was something audiences could recognize immediately: affection. The relationship worked because neither character was simply a stereotype. And slowly, something unexpected began happening behind the scenes too. For viewers, Martin and Frasier Crane were fictional characters. For Grammer, the role began carrying a different kind of emotional weight. He had spent years without the chance to experience a normal father-son relationship, and now he was spending long hours every week working beside a man who naturally brought steadiness and kindness into the room. Mahoney wasn't trying to replace anyone. He wasn't playing therapist to his co-star. He was simply being himself. That may have been exactly what made the relationship so meaningful. Their friendship developed through years of working together, sharing difficult scenes, joking between takes, and experiencing the pressures of a long-running television series. The cameras captured the fictional relationship, but Grammer was also getting something personal from those years. He was learning what a dependable father figure could feel like. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment when everything suddenly changed. It happened gradually, through ordinary conversations and years of simply having someone there. And eventually, Grammer found the words to explain what Mahoney had come to mean. Kelsey Grammer eventually said something about John Mahoney that transformed the way many people viewed their relationship. He explained that he had never really had a father, and that spending 11 years with Mahoney gave him an understanding of what it might have been like to have one. That admission made the Martin Crane storyline feel completely different in hindsight. Every disagreement, every joke, and every quiet moment between the characters suddenly carried another layer. Grammer wasn't claiming that television could literally replace his father. He was describing something much more human: the experience of finally discovering a relationship he had been missing for most of his life. Mahoney became a model of steadiness, loyalty, and decency. Those qualities mattered deeply to Grammer because they represented something he had never been able to experience consistently while growing up. The remarkable part is that Mahoney may never have realized just how important his presence had become. But their story was about to become even deeper, because the bond between them wasn't limited to two actors playing father and son. It became something that would stay with Grammer long after the cameras stopped rolling. The emotional connection between Kelsey Grammer and John Mahoney didn't exist in isolation. David Hyde Pierce, who played Niles Crane, became another important part of that unusual television family. Together, the three actors created something that felt remarkably natural. Frasier and Niles could compete, argue, and try to outsmart each other, while Martin often stood between them as the voice of common sense. But beneath the comedy was genuine affection. Grammer has spoken about the closeness the three men developed during the show's long run, describing a connection that went beyond simply showing up for work. They spent years together through exhausting production schedules, personal challenges, celebrations, and difficult moments. That kind of environment can either create distance or build an extraordinary bond. In their case, it created the latter. Mahoney's presence gave the group a sense of stability, and Grammer increasingly valued that. The man who had spent much of his childhood missing a father figure now had two people beside him who felt almost like family. But the hardest moments would reveal just how much Mahoney's presence truly mattered. Behind the laughter of Frasier, Kelsey Grammer was still dealing with the complicated emotions that had followed him for decades. Fame doesn't erase grief, and working on a sitcom doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. There were periods when personal struggles made emotional scenes especially difficult for him. Sometimes, the feelings behind a scene became more powerful than the dialogue itself. Mahoney's personality provided a quiet counterbalance. He wasn't known for dramatic displays. His strength was often in simply being dependable. He showed up, did the work, treated people with respect, and remained steady. For someone like Grammer, those ordinary qualities could carry enormous meaning. A father doesn't always teach through speeches. Sometimes, the lesson is simply being there. Over 11 seasons, Mahoney gave Grammer thousands of those small moments. None were designed to become famous memories, but together, they formed something lasting. And years later, Grammer would admit that the emotional effect of those years had never completely disappeared. Even long after Frasier ended, Kelsey Grammer remained unusually emotional when discussing John Mahoney, family, and the passage of time. He has described himself as someone who can become emotional very easily, especially when something reminds him of love, family, or the fragile beauty of human relationships. That vulnerability is striking, because television stars are often expected to present polished answers about their careers. Grammer doesn't always do that. When Mahoney's name comes up, the carefully prepared Hollywood language tends to disappear. What remains is gratitude. The tears aren't really about a television show. They're about what the show represented. Grammer lost his biological father when he was young, then lost other members of his family, before he had fully grown into adulthood. Later, he found a man who gave him 11 years of something he had never expected to experience. That makes every memory more complicated. The laughter carries sadness, the nostalgia carries gratitude, and eventually, Grammer would have to face the hardest part of all: losing Mahoney for real. In February 2018, John Mahoney died at the age of 77 after health complications. For fans, it was the loss of one of television's most beloved character actors. For Kelsey Grammer, it was something far more personal. The man who had played Martin Crane for 11 seasons was suddenly gone, and with him went a relationship that had become deeply meaningful outside the fictional world of Frasier. Grammer's response was simple rather than elaborate. He shared a photograph of the two men together and wrote words that immediately caught people's attention. Mahoney was his father, and he loved him. It was an incredibly personal statement. Not "my co-star," not simply "my friend, father." The word carried decades of history behind it. Mahoney had entered Grammer's life when he was already an adult, but the relationship had still managed to fill a space that had existed since childhood. The timing made the loss even more painful. After 11 years of having Mahoney nearby, Grammer once again had to experience the absence of a father figure. Those few words became one of the most powerful tributes Kelsey Grammer ever gave. They explained why John Mahoney's death affected him so deeply, without requiring a long speech. Mahoney wasn't literally his biological father, but the emotional truth was undeniable. Their relationship had become something far more significant than a casting decision. For 11 years, Grammer had worked beside a man who demonstrated qualities he associated with fatherhood: loyalty, honesty, patience, and reliability. Then suddenly, that presence was gone. The irony was difficult to miss. Grammer had already experienced the death of his biological father decades earlier. Now, in adulthood, he had found another father figure and lost him too. Yet Mahoney left something behind that death couldn't erase. He had shown Grammer what a father-son relationship could look like, even if it arrived decades later than expected. And when Frasier eventually returned years after Mahoney's death, Grammer faced a painful question. How do you bring back a show built around a family when one of the people who made that family feel real is no longer there? The answer would lead to a series of quiet tributes that fans might easily miss. When Frasier returned years later, something important was missing. Martin Crane couldn't simply walk through the door again. John Mahoney was gone, and Grammer knew the revival had to acknowledge that loss. Instead of pretending nothing had changed, the new series allowed Martin's absence to become part of the story. It was a difficult reminder that time had moved forward, both for Frasier and for Grammer himself. But one detail made the tribute even more personal. Grammer quietly found ways to honor Mahoney without turning every tribute into a dramatic announcement. A bar in the revival carries Mahoney's name, while another character is named John. To casual viewers, these details might seem completely ordinary, but for anyone who knew the history between the two actors, they carried another meaning. Grammer wasn't simply reviving a television character. He was carrying a piece of his TV father forward. There's a remarkable reversal in the new Frasier. The man who once played the son who needed his father is now portraying someone much closer to the father figure himself. Frasier has a son of his own, and Grammer has stepped into a different generation of the story. In a strange way, the lessons he received from Mahoney now live inside the character he plays. The student became the father. Grammer lost his biological father as a teenager. Decades later, he found a second father figure in John Mahoney, only to lose him too. That makes their story unusually bittersweet. Mahoney couldn't change Grammer's childhood, but he could give him memories that had been missing from it. 11 seasons created something real enough to survive beyond the final episode. And Grammer never allowed that connection to disappear. John Mahoney entered Kelsey Grammer's life as an actor hired to play Martin Crane. He left it as something much more meaningful. Their story reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes, a person arrives unexpectedly and teaches you what you were missing. Grammer lost his father twice, but he also found something he never expected. 11 years of memories with a man he could genuinely call Dad. And that may be the most powerful legacy Frasier ever created.